We are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now tackling the concept of the Shroud of Turin. And today I have a special guest who's an expert on the topic, and that is Dr. Andrew Casper. Welcome to MythVision, my friend.
Thanks for having me. It's a really great pleasure to be here, and I always relish the opportunity to talk about the Shroud of Turin.
I am very appreciative of you coming on. I've had a few people who said, get an expert. Yeah. And they, of course, are believers, though. Like, get an expert. And I'm thinking to myself, they're really confident in this. So the point is, I want everyone to go get the book, An Artful Relic, The Shroud of Turin. And how do I pronounce this? Is it Baroque?
Baroque.
Baroque, Italy. In Baroque, Italy. And I guess that's where it was housed, I suspect.
Well, Baroque Italy refers to the period. In like the history of art, for example, the Baroque period is the 1600s, and that's the rough century when the Shroud of Turin really emerged as the most important relic in all of Christianity. So, I'm talking about sort of the emergence of the Shroud in that period of the 1600s, which is the Baroque period in Italy.
See, I'm learning something every day. I'm just a host, and I'm a student of every guest I ever have on, and I just thought this is some location. And see, you already taught me there's a period, the Baroque period in Italy. And this is where this is being emerging. So everyone go get the book. I'll tell you why you really need to get this book real quick. I was watching lectures online of Dr. Casper, and I said, okay, let's see what he has to say before I go to interview him on this topic. Let's just put it this way. He is very appreciative, delicate with the topic, but he's an expert. He knows exactly what he's talking about when it comes to the buildup of this whole concept of relics and icons and you name it. And I could just tell you that he goes thorough and very deep into the concept of what is going on and why something like this would be seen as actually the shroud that housed Jesus, the Christ. And so that's a powerful, powerful image. I'd like to show everyone real quick. And, this is the Shroud of Turin. Everybody who's looked at this thing says, there's the face of Jesus. And, he's got bloodstained, the whole nine, as everyone, has looked into this, has a concept or an idea about what this is. So, Dr. Casper, if you will, tell us a little bit of your expertise. What makes you an expert in this topic?
Well, what makes me an expert is the fact that it took me over a decade to write my book. So I've been working on it for a long time. The book just came out in September of 2021, so it's pretty fresh right now. But I've been fascinated by the Shroud of Turin ever since I was a little kid. And from a non-religious perspective, I should just be upfront and say I was fascinated by it, not because I believed necessarily from the time I was 9 years old that it was the authentic relic of Jesus Christ, but I was really fascinated just by the idea of this really tantalizing object that for many people kind of is the tangible physical proof of Jesus Christ's death and resurrection. And I became interested in it around the time that the shroud was scientifically studied. It was carbon dated. The cloth itself was carbon dated in 1988. And the results came back that the cloth itself, on which you see the images of Jesus and the supposed stains of blood, the cloth itself could not possibly date all the way back to the time of Christ. It probably dates to the 12 or 1300s. Now, I will say there are plenty of people out there that dispute the carbon dating itself. Either they dispute the methodology, they dispute the sample that was used for the carbon dating, they dispute the results. There's even conspiracy theories. I'm kind of not going to wade into that, at least not right now. But that is sort of the period in which I got interested in the shroud. And then when I went to college, I got really interested in the history of art. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, got my PhD at Penn in 2007. And while I was there, I kind of had this resurging kind of renaissance of an interest in the shroud. And it kind of dawned on me that I could actually look at the Shroud of Turin from the perspective of the history of art. Now, typically when someone says art and Shroud of Turin in the same sentence, they mean the Shroud of Turin was manufactured to be a fraudulent relic. And that's not really my take. I'm not saying it is or is not that. But my take more is that the Shroud of Turin emerged at a particular time, Baroque Italy, sort of from the late 1500s through the 1600s, when art itself was elevated to a level of prestige that I think is kind of different than how we think of art today. For example, Today, we think of art as kind of the opposite of something that's real. You say like, oh, a work of art is artificial by its very definition. But at the time that I'm looking at, the Shroud of Turin was actually promoted as a work of art, but not in a way that promoted it as a fake relic or a fake icon. Instead, they promoted it as a work of art by God. Now, that's kind of the thrust of my book. Now, how I sort of develop my professional expertise in this is I spent, as I mentioned, about a decade researching how and why the Shroud of Turin emerged from the late 1500s through the 1600s. I should say the Shroud of Turin did not become the Shroud of Turin, meaning the city of Turin in northern Italy, until 1578, when it was moved from its former home in southern France to the city of Turin. So before 1578, it was just the Shroud, basically. The 1578 became the Shroud of Turin, and then from that point on, then it kind of became the relic that we know now today as the Shroud of Turin. So I've now spent a decade going to Turin, researching, going to archives, uncovering documents, finding copies of the Shroud that were made in the 1600s, and gathering all of this material that in my book comes together and basically says the Shroud of Turin was promoted as a divine painting from the late 1500s through the 1600s, in the sense that they upheld the Shroud as something that is both artificial and a work of art. That's kind of not really the way we think of artifice and authenticity today. We think of those as like diametrically opposed, right? Like they're, one is the opposite of the other. But it's a fascinating thing where this book actually kind of forces us to question or even reconsider the frameworks by which we define authenticity today versus how audiences back 400, 500, 600 years ago defined authenticity. The differences are actually pretty stark. So in a lot of ways, my book on the Shroud of Turin is not just about a key period in the history of the Shroud of Turin. It also really is about the sort of, the frameworks of belief that may or may not be the same as what we have today.
This begs the question, right? Like, are they thinking this literal cloth literally comes from the first century and literally was the literal actual embodiment of Jesus in this, this image that is there? I guess because the way we think of it now, we think so scientific and historical. We expect that cloth had to be there in, 33 AD if we use the calendar, and it had to be the one that actually surrounded Jesus's body, and et cetera, et cetera. But you build up this case in your presentation, and I suspect in your book, about images and how these iconography, these images kind of come to life for people, even though they're art. They still carry life with them. Would you like to elaborate on that some? Does that play any significant role in particular as to what the Shroud is doing?
Absolutely. No, it's a very perceptive comment you just made. So and I should be very clear, my book does not weigh in on the modern notion of authenticity. I don't say it's real. I don't say it's fake. I just kind of leave that modern and contemporary, argument, which overwhelms. Like when people talk about the Shroud of Turin today, 98% of the things that are written or blogged about or podcasted about are, very, very stridently either in favor or against authenticity. My book does not weigh in on that at all. But when you're saying that sort of the images sort of carry this, this aspect that allowed people to really believe in them in a way that is, I think, very different than our very positivist society today, where we have such a rational post-enlightenment insistence on, objectivity. And there's nothing wrong with that. Believe me, there's nothing wrong with that, but it simply is different than what we see in the period that I'm looking at. So to give you kind of background on this, when you say kind of the emergence of the liveliness of images, I regard the Shroud of Turin in my book as a religious image. That is to say that it is a picture of Jesus Christ that triggers in people this really strong, ardent belief that what they're looking at is more than just a picture of Jesus. And this is at a period when there was this renewed faith in images, especially in the Catholic world. Just to, give you a little bit of the kind of bare bones, like historical background here. by the end of the 1500s, the Reformation resulted in the split of the Protestant and Catholic churches. Most people know this. One of the issues that was under debate between the Protestants and the Catholics was the validity of religious images and the validity of religious relics. The Protestants were more comfortable with images kind of not being a focus for people's devotional practices. If you look at for example, the iconoclastic revolt in Northern Europe, they actually violently removed images from churches in various places at various times. That's in the North. That's the Protestants in the North. The Catholics are basically digging in their heels and saying, no, we believe in images. And the Catholic Church is reinforcing that fundamental belief that images are really important for emboldening one's faith. The Shroud of Turin is a particular kind of religious image that is especially useful for demonstrating what images can do, because it's not your mainstream image. Like, I say it's an artful relic. I don't mean it's like a painting in the same way that like the Mona Lisa is a painting by Leonardo da Vinci. It was believed to be a work of art, but a work of art by God. So that kind of already makes it very different than like a work of art by, a kind of, regular human,
Right.
Artist, flesh and blood person like you and I. So in the late 1500s, there was this sort of like all of a sudden this explosion in belief that images are really important, and images can do things. Like there's miracles that are attributed to images, certainly the Shroud of Turin among them. So there's already this kind of stage that's set in the historical moment when the Shroud of Turin sort of bursts onto the scene in 1578 in Turin. There's already this historical moment that conditioned people to really believe in images as conveying something more than just a picture. Like they contained within them some divine power or divine essence. And I think for that reason, the Shroud of Turin kind of emerged when it did, because the environment was ripe for that kind of belief in it.
If I may, in your lecture, I almost wish we had all these images you brought up in your lecture, which was fascinating. I highly recommend, I'm sure these are in your book and people can really delve deep into kind of the history of what's going on here. But we might need to back up a little for our audience who's not really acquainted with knowing, well, what do you mean an image? Thou shalt have no graven image, right? Yeah. And then what's going on with this? What is the apologetic that the church is trying to make on behalf of images? Because you point out a couple different writings that are defenses of saying, no, images are kind of like our cell phone, like you talked about in your interview. You see me right now for the audience. You see me through the screen, and you're communicating at a screen to communicate with me. Now, the screen doesn't have the power, but you're talking to me as though I have the power. And it's kind of like the image is the screen to the divine. However, that line is extremely blurred, especially with us looking for images. And you talk about this, even though you're not into that science. I think it's psychology. I'm not sure what the natural sciences are for this, but that we have image in our brain. We literally have image processing. We look for faces. This is all like built into us evolution wise. Like we are looking for faces. So you have images that represent those things, and we're looking at them, and next thing you know, they're moving or they're doing things that Can you tell us?
I'm glad you brought up, the Old Testament prohibition against images. I mean, God is very clear in the Ten Commandments: "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image of anything." ... That's basically a prohibition against making images. Now, as you know, the entire history of Christianity, from the 3rd or so century on, once the 4th century, and Christianity became officially sanctioned in ancient Rome, images are everywhere. It's a fundamental aspect of the Christian faith. That violation, really, against the 2nd commandment is kind of argued as, well, we understand what God is saying. What God is saying, though, is that you shouldn't have idols, right? Meaning you should not believe that an image is somehow itself the possessor of divine power, because then you can worship an image as a god without that image actually being the one true and only God. So you're right. The metaphor that I use whenever I talk about icons in my classes that I teach, in the lecture that you saw that's posted online about icons, I use the metaphor of the iPhone, because we all naturally understand that we use our iPhones to communicate with people through FaceTime, or like how you and I are communicating right now through our computer screens, neither one of us has any delusion that the other lives inside our screen, right? Like, I'm not living inside your computer and you're not living inside of mine. That's the sort of justification that the early Christian church made to sort of get around that prohibition against images. It's like you have to understand that when you are praying in the direction of an image, you are simply given access to the holy person represented through some sort of mystical technology that brings you in communication with them. The wrong thing would be if you are praying to an image of a holy figure, to equate that image with the holy figure, as if the holy figure lives inside the painted wood panel. So that is sort of like how Christian images are sort of understood to sort of get around that proclamation by God that thou shalt not make unto thee any images. The Shroud of Turin, though, like other kinds of what we call image relics, kind of throws a wrench in that whole understanding. Because the Shroud of Turin isn't just a picture. The Shroud of Turin, according to believers, contains actual traces of Christ's body by virtue of stains of blood that soaked into the cloth when the cloth was placed over his body when it was taken down from the cross. That means that unlike most other images, which are just painted representations or sculpted representations or mosaic representations, the Shroud of Turin actually does contain physical presence of the body of Christ. That blurs the boundaries a bit. And those blurring of the boundaries occurs not just with the Shroud of Turin, but with any image. There's always, like, the church is always a little bit kind of uneasy about the ardentness with which people often demonstrate their devotion towards images, because you always have to wonder, wait, is that person misunderstanding that the image is actually the person represented and not just a picture of the person represented? The Shroud of Turin is a justified way you can actually pray to the shroud and, in essence, pray directly to Jesus Christ, because pieces of his body are believed to be sort of trapped within the fibers of the shroud.
You know, this is quite a new way of thinking that I don't think we're used to doing. And even people who research this really will find fascinating, especially historically, because when I look at, and as a Protestant that I was for many, many years, I was very pro, like, no images, don't do this. Those are idols, this and that. And you can see why, exactly for the reason you just described. I mean, people start equating the image with the divine. But I looked at Catholics and I thought, these guys have so many gods and idols, and look at all this stuff. And maybe they do. Maybe they do. Who am I to judge now looking back, right? I'm like, oh, well, these are like, they have real physical objects to represent those things. And, one of the claims I found historically on the term atheism, because there's this debate, like, what does the word even mean? And I know, what's that got to do with this discussion? Well, in early Christianity, when the Roman Empire is finding out about Christianity, they called them atheist. They didn't have images, it seems, just like Jews did not have images to represent their God. They may have had a temple, but like, they were like, where's that idol for your God? Like, we don't see your God, and therefore you don't have a God. So you're an atheist, is what they would kind of label them, probably derogatory wise. But you mentioned Mother Mary. You were giving this lecture talking about this and the tears and like the things that they see. Oh, there's water coming out. I heard one story, horrible story, that there's a toilet leak that was happening and people were literally kissing Mary's feet or something. I can't even remember. Do you know what I'm talking about?
That specific case, no, but certainly the issue of crying icons is an old one and still continues today. I'm teaching a class currently, a course at my university on icons, and we've talked about these modern instances of statues that are believed to cry or even cry blood even, and that modern contemporary phenomenon does link back to very, very old stories. Like, as long as there have been Christian images, there have been stories of icons that kind of behave in very human ways, like crying or bleeding when they're struck. Like, that's not a new phenomenon. It's not simply a relic of the past. It's a continuation for centuries and millennia.
Yeah, this makes me think the shroud fits in this kind of, in a way, in this milieu. But like you said, even more so if the body of Christ was there contained and there's DNA left. There's this,
Right.
Because especially when you think the Catholics, you know how they are about transubstantiation in the blood. So there's this significant magic in the blood of Jesus. And so I wonder if this comes to life. Are there any certain practices pertaining to the shroud other than just praying to it that you know of historically that play a significant role, kind of like the Lord's Supper becoming transubstantiation? Did they have a ritual pertaining to the shroud that was like a really interesting religious practice that you know of?
Well, the rituals that pertain to the Shroud of Turin, especially during the period that I look at in my book, are themselves not that unusual, but they're kind of magnified to a scale that makes them unusual. The reason why the shroud sort of, became, without really, I think, exaggeration, the most famous Christian artifact in the Christian world, at least in the late 15 and 1600s, is that during that century or more, century and a half or so, the Shroud of Turin was placed on public exhibition, not quite yearly, but very, very often, nearly yearly for 120 years. And during that time, the shroud would be displayed publicly, and it would draw tens of thousands of pilgrims to Turin. To like the main city square, the same big city square that you go to today if you ever go to Turin, like the main sort of center of the city, big open space. And the shroud was then sort of like, held, like, there'd be like a balcony that would be constructed in the middle of the square. And the bishop and church dignitaries would gather together, and they would stand on this elevated platform. And then before these tens of thousands of pilgrims that arrived and jam-packed the city square of Turin, they would then unfurl the shroud, and there'd be trumpet calls, and there'd be all this commotion, and people would drop to their knees. That would happen every year, usually on May 4th, which was the designated feast day of the Shroud of Turin that sort of celebrates, like, kind of an officially sanctioned, like, church holiday that would celebrate the shroud. It would also happen on other occasions as well. But May 4th was kind of the main day. Now, that was kind of believed. I kind of argue at various points in my book that is kind of a almost a sacramental event. And what I mean by that is, you mentioned transubstantiation, the belief that in the rite of Holy Communion, the matter of bread and the matter of wine miraculously transform into the material of the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. When you have the shroud exhibited, it's actually linked up to a visual sort of exhibition of the host that was very popular in the period that I'm looking at, where a priest would, saying mass, would raise up the communion wafer, and that's the moment when transubstantiation would occur. The Shroud of Turin kind of becomes another visual apparatus for seeing the body of Christ emerge before your very eyes, because, like I said, it is believed to contain, traces of Christ's body. And you wouldn't see the Shroud of Turin very often. This is one thing that people kind of forget or don't even know today. Like, the Shroud of Turin is kept packed away out of sight for way longer periods of time than when it's ever actually on view. So when these exhibitions occurred, that was like the one chance you get to see it. Even though those are almost yearly events, I mean, it was hard for people outside of the city of Turin to actually take the time and energy to travel there. So you might get one shot in your lifetime to see the shroud. And when you see it, then you see it unfurled. That's a moment where all of a sudden, poof, Christ comes into view, so to speak. So that's that kind of display of holy artifacts, like, that's common. But the Shroud of Turin was a kind of holy artifact that kind of trumped the others, so to speak. It was really the most prestigious of them all. So you get these massive, massive, massive crowds coming for these events that were like just these, gigantic occasions.
I would love to maybe ask a few, I guess, critical questions of the shroud, if that's okay with you, just to get your personal opinion. Maybe your professional thought actually is the goal, but I obviously know that there's this polemic that goes online, and it's like, is it real? Is it fake? And really, at the end of the day, I think as you investigate and study these things, there's probably going to be, do you have faith already? Are you a believer who like kind of needs this up front, and you already sold on it being true, and then now you're validating that? Or are you just a skeptic who outright can't possibly allow for this to be true? And I'm just going to tell you where I'm at, and then I'd love to maybe get your thoughts. For me, people are selling ankle bones of Peter, or at least what I mean by selling is they've got them out on display. You have relics and parts and body parts and pieces of the cross all over. This is a common thing. And for me, I'm looking at Bayes probability here. It's like, what's the prior probability that if the church is constantly doing this with pieces of the cross, pieces of saints' bones and burial spots and where he was born and where he was, died, et cetera, this common trope seems to me that the prior probability that this relic would also fit the criteria of something like that doesn't mean that there wasn't significance. People saw this is where Peter was buried. Wow, that carries significance. He probably wasn't buried there. The point is this is something that has developed. Do you think in some way, and I guess I'm trying to have you professionally and politely answer this question, in some way it fits into that kind of prior probability criteria?
So listen, I think the reality is the trafficking of fraudulent relics and fraudulent icons and fraudulent artifacts. I mean, that is a reality of the rise of Christian devotion to those kinds of objects from the Middle Ages onward. Now, I feel like sort of deep inside your question is like, will I weigh in on whether or not the shroud is real? Here's how I get asked this all the time, as you might imagine.
Right.
Now I have my personal sort of stake in this, and my professional stake is different. Like I mentioned, my book itself does not say it's real or not. It's kind of like that question is kind of left off to the side deliberately. But when people ask me, is the Shroud of Turin real? Here's the first way I answer that. I say, yes. I believe the Shroud of Turin that is in the city of Turin still today is the original cloth that was transferred to the city of Turin in 1578. I think that object has been in existence from that moment up until today. Now, that's a little bit different than the question of, can we then trace that same cloth back further, centuries back to the time of Jesus Christ? That's where it simply gets murky, and it does become a matter of faith. So here's the thing. The carbon dating in 1988, which I mentioned before, that came to the conclusion that the cloth itself of the shroud could not possibly date, or is very unlikely to date any earlier than the 1200s. Again, I recognize there are plenty of people that have criticisms about the methodologies, the conclusions, and even the sort of motivations behind that carbon dating. I'm not going to weigh into that. That's beyond my interest. But the fact of the matter is, it is hard to trace it back. We have documents for the possession of the shroud that go back to the 1300s. Those documentary references to the shroud are far less numerous before that. People do like to make, there's a cottage industry of like tracing the particular features of Christ that appears in the shroud in various like medieval, Byzantine, and late antique representations of Jesus Christ to ultimately make the argument that like, even if there aren't like paper records of the shroud that go back to the time of Christ, maybe you can connect a kind of image record back to the time. I really do think the shroud is something where you can see in it what you want to see in it, either from a believer's point of view or from a skeptic's point of view. Whether or not I agree with one of those points of view, or whether or not you agree with one of those points of view, or whether or not someone else agrees with one of those points of view, I honestly got to say is kind of irrelevant. I don't know that there is that much danger in someone believing something that maybe others would say, well, this probably can't physically be the authentic relic of Jesus Christ. The fact of the matter is, people they pin their faith on things, and that's a personal decision. That's you don't want people to get hurt. You don't want people to get defrauded. And as long as that doesn't happen, it might be harmless if, in fact, one were to conclusively prove that the shroud is not materially real, but people believe that it must go back to the time of Jesus. Two related points of this, I think people sometimes don't either forget or don't really know. The Catholic Church themselves are actually agnostic on the very question of authenticity. The Catholic Church does not declare the Shroud of Turin to be the authentic relic used in the burial of Jesus Christ's body. They also don't claim that that's fake. They're just they kind of take a non-committed stance on it. And there are documents issued by the Pope that say this is a really important icon. that triggers one's memory and understanding and devotions towards the death and resurrection of Jesus, right? So the church doesn't actually definitively declare one way or the other. Secondly, when you have the documentary evidence for the shroud going back to the 1300s, some of those early documents actually have to do with the fact that there was some concern that the shroud was being misunderstood as an authentic relic. There are documents that basically say, hey, listen, people are promoting the shroud as the authentic burial Christ of Jesus, even though we know the guy that painted it, and people are being misled. Now, that's a murky kind of issue because there have been people that attack the validity of the documents, and it gets a very, I mean, anything that has to do with the shroud is just like this crowded thicket of alternate points of view, as you no doubt know, and the shroud's not unique in that regard. But, you know, it suggests that, you know, whether or not the shroud is actually materially real doesn't have to sort of matter. Like, you can be a faithful Christian and not believe the shroud is real. And I suppose you maybe could believe the shroud is real and not be a Christian. I suppose maybe that doesn't work. But I think the point is, like, and I know people, like I have family members and friends who are, you know, practicing Christians and don't believe the shroud is real. And it doesn't really harm their faith, I don't think, in any kind of way. But so I think, like, there's opportunities for people to sort of see in the shroud what they want. And, you know, it's just, I've learned the hard way that making a definitive declaration for or against authenticity on our contemporary standard of what counts as real is just kind of a dangerous thing to do. You're going to piss off people one way or the other.
That's a great point. And I mean, I will grant, let me just present this in a way of just kind of getting your thoughts. I'm a skeptic who doesn't think it is authentic, right? I start with a prior probability, not because I know it's not authentic, because I'm looking at prior probability. And that's a historical methodology that I'm considering here, going, what is the probability here? But at the end of the day, if it was real, I mean, I could even see that be impossible and still not be a Christian, still not believe. Just like if we did find a piece of the cross, like, so what? Like, you found a piece of the cross. You could still walk away and say, well, yeah, this is the device in which he died on. So this means he's God in the flesh. You see where I'm trying to be conveniently polite and yet still say, you don't have to draw a conclusion because a relic or a piece or something could potentially be that goes back. So I just want to paint that, like, my antagonism to this whole, you know, fundamentalism that I do online is not, I can't wait to just debunk everything in my path to show it's not authentic. No, I'd love to find out. Holy moly, we just found, you know, the church in Ephesus that Paul was at. And it's like, I would love to find out more stuff. And I'd be amazed to do so. But at the end of the day, this relic is highly revered. And it's just on a pedestal on another level that if there were evidence, this is me taking a jab at the believing side, but if there were evidence to conclude this was not authentic, it wouldn't matter if we presented a mile-high pile of this evidence, because at the end of the day, somehow you're wrong. I mean, there's, you know, Bart Ehrman said when I was talking about contradictions one time, he said, Derek, if you try hard enough, you can literally make anything harmonize, anything. And we were talking about how one apologist that I knew was harmonizing two things. He goes, but if you try hard enough, sure, give it to them, whatever they want it to be. They'll do anything to make it become what they want it to be. And that's a common trope for not just Christians, but believers in general. And there are even non-believers who will kind of do anything they can to keep from things being true. So it's a common human thing I think we do. At the end of the day, I just wanted to get your opinion, you know, on that.
Well, yeah, no, I'm really glad that you say, like, we kind of need to take a polite stance on thing. You know, this day and age right now, I mean, politeness is something that seems to be in short supply. I think we all could use a little bit more politeness to each other, even for people that we just ardently disagree with. And maybe that's a naive take on my point. It probably is, but listen, you know, like, this is sort of what the motivation for my book is. Like, I'm just kind of tired of, like, the fixation with, is it real or is it not? And then everything is staked on it. And so, for example, people that just write off the shroud as like, well, we know it's not real, so why even pay attention to it? It's like, well, it's still, even if we know now that the Shroud of Turin is not the authentic burial Christ of Jesus, and again, I'm not saying it is or is not,
Right,
but
right.
even we know that,
Yeah.
the fact is, that for, millions of Christians, this was the fundamental artifact of the Christian faith for the period that I'm looking at. To throw out that history just because now we know something that they didn't know back then, to me is really silly. Moreover, the history of it doesn't have to sort of be the evidence itself, right? I'm expecting there to be reviews of my book, for example, but from people, I don't know this will happen, but I expect it's likely that it could happen that someone criticizes my book because I'm making a big deal about something that they disagree with from an authenticist perspective today. And I'm like, well, it doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter. Again, the historical fact is this thing was a really important, it still is for many people, but especially back in the late 15 or through the 1600s, I mean, this was just a massively important artifact, an object, a relic, an image, whatever you want to call it, that was a touchstone for people's faith. That's the facts. The fact of whether it's real or not by today's standards is just a kind of different question.
This is great. Okay. Because the more I study from academics, the more I find out that they're actually in love with the subject matter that they're researching, even if they draw certain conclusions. And I think too often internet keyboard warriors that get online, they just kind of want to like, it's a lie. It's like this and that. I've even have guys who come on and they think that maybe Jesus didn't exist. And I have PhDs that have come on and debated this subject and have said, nah, I just don't think the evidence is good. And they're arguing that. At the end of the day, they also point out something. Whether a man existed or not, what really mattered to the Christian, even though they'll argue, yeah, there had to be a guy in hypostatic union and all this stuff. Like, really what matters is the Christ. And the Christ is a celestial right hand of God, seated powerful deity Godhead. And he's the one who walks on water and is born of a virgin and rises from the dead. And at the end of the day, if you think all of that didn't happen, I mean, sure, you could say, I don't think that's true. But you could. I've heard of mythicists, for example, who believed in Jesus and he never existed as a man. They just believe in the myth of these things. And I'm like, what? So I think more as I research with academics like you and others, you guys are in love with this stuff, no matter what your conclusions are. You love figuring out how humans thought and why we did this and what. It's just amazing.
No, that's exactly right. I'm like, I came to my interest in the Shroud from a largely secular point of view. And like, I'm fascinated by the idea. I'm fascinated by what it says about humanity, what the Shroud sort of says about belief. Whether I share those beliefs or not is kind of a separate thing, but like, it tells us a lot about who we are as a collective human race. Can I also, though, say, like, there are some really tantalizing aspects about the Shroud that I think are the reason why there is so much fascinating, even after the carbon dating, why there's still, like, the carbon dating didn't really, I'll talk about this exactly in 1 second, why the carbon dating didn't really dampen the enthusiasm for the Shroud. And there's still plenty of people that are like, this is the be all end all. There are some really fascinating aspects of it. So put that image back up.
Okay.
So what we're looking at here is a double image of the Shroud of Turin. On the left is an image of the Shroud with the ghostly imprint of Jesus Christ. You can see the stains of blood. The black and white image on the other side is a photographic negative. Now, there's a history behind this. So the Shroud of Turin was photographed for the first time in the year 1898. And it was just simply for the purposes of documenting from a photographic medium the Shroud of Turin. Well, what happened is the amateur photographer who was commissioned to take that photograph in 1898, he was developing the plates that showed the negative. And when he saw the negative plate, emerging in the chemical bath, what he saw is a really fascinating aspect about the Shroud of Turin. That is that the Shroud of Turin is actually clearer when seen in a photographic negative than when it is in a positive. And the implication, the way that people take this, is that, people regard the shroud as like a proto photograph, like it's some sort of primitive photographic process that results in the image of Christ's body being, sort of burned on the surface of the cloth or what have you. Or that it's like somehow God is encoding the shroud image itself. And we had to wait, humanity had to wait until the advent of the technology of photography to be able to decode the mystery of Christ's appearance of shroud. But it is really tantalizing. I mean, look at that. I mean, the negative image shows a body that looks much more realistically three-dimensional. So this is sort of like a mystery that, I think is really one of the reasons why the Shroud of Turin is still such a provocative image. The other thing I'll share is I've seen the Shroud of Turin once. Some people might think, wait a minute, you've written a whole book on the Shroud of Turin, you've only seen it once. Well, the thing is, the Shroud of Turin, they mentioned, is rarely on public view. Since the year 2000, it's been on public view a little bit more frequently than typical. And so it was exhibited in the year 2000, and then again in 2010, again in 2015. It was supposed to be exhibited in 2020, but that was canceled due to COVID. And I think there are plans to have it exhibited again very soon. I saw it in 2010. That was my really started my research on the shroud. My interest had been, for a long time, but my real serious academic interest in the shroud began, or the work on what became my book, started in 2010. So I flew to Turin for the first time to see the shroud. It was on an official exhibition, which is like a 6-week period from April through May in the year 2010, when you could basically get a ticket to go and see the shroud in person. I've been fascinated by the shroud at that point I was 30 some years old at that point in my life, 31 years old. And I'd been fascinated by the shroud for like well over half of that, for 20 or so years at that point. I've been really fascinated by the Shroud of Turin. And so I finally had the opportunity to see it in person for the first time. And the story I like to tell is that I was actually in Rome for a conference. So I flew to Turin from Rome. So because I was in Rome for a conference, I had like a suit with me, which I don't usually travel with. I don't usually go to Italy and wear suits, especially as a tourist. So I fly to Turin, and I had a ticket, like a timed entry ticket, where you sort of like you reserve a time, and that's when you can enter into the church and go see the shroud. And I was getting ready in my hotel room. And I was putting on like regular clothes, and there was some weird, I can't explain it. I really cannot explain it. Even from a secularist point of view, I cannot explain this. I had this compulsion to dress up. So I got the suit out from my suitcase that I wore in my conference in Rome. I'm laughing at myself because to me, this is ridiculous, right? But I put on my shirt and my tie and my sport coat, and I go out of my hotel and walk to the site where I enter and sort of go through the whole meandering line. And I see the Shroud of Turin for the first time. And I can tell you, I've never seen a more charismatic object than the Shroud of Turin. And, a lot of this certainly is like, when you see like a celebrity or a hero or a role model that you've always admired but never seen in the flesh before, a lot of it has to do with that. And I was expecting to be sort of like excited by seeing the shroud. I was not expecting, however, to be as captivated by it. I mean, the charisma that radiates from that thing took me by surprise. I can't explain that, right? And I tell my students all the time, I'm very upfront with my students. Like, I'm not today a religious person, but I cannot explain that. I cannot explain that sort of captivate. I couldn't stop looking at it. I just really could not stop looking at it. And the way that this exhibition was set up was like you get a ticket to get up close to the shroud, and you have to sort of have a ticket to sort of go into this sort of route that allows you that. But at any other time, day or night, you could enter into the church. It's in the Cathedral of Turin, and it was displayed above the altar, and you can see it from a distance from the back of the church. You just can't get up close. I went back to the church all the time. Whenever I had a free moment, I'm like, I'll go see the shroud. I'm like, I just kept on being drawn back to it. So I understand totally from direct experience why there is this sort of like just absolute fascination with it. It is a visually compelling kind of thing. You go back to the picture, you're going to put that picture back up.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the things that's really captivating about it is the fact that it's not clear. Like it's a somewhat hazy image. And so I think there is that kind of, there's that psychological sort of a faculty of projection that we have. Like we have this compulsion to want to, make order out of things that are disordered. And so like seeing images in clouds, or like seeing, if you, for example, see the patterns in, let's say, the bark of a tree, or like the veins of marble or some sort of veined stone, and you sort of see pictures emerge. That same kind of thing happens with the shroud. Now, there's more of a clear image of Christ's body in the shroud. It's not like it's only there if you want to see it, but it is just sort of elusive enough. I think it kind of just, out of necessity, kind of draws you into it and kind of captures your attention for a lot longer than what visual objects tend to capture our attention today. So I get it. I totally get it. And I'm kind of, I share this experience all the time and very openly. I can't explain. I was, taken aback by that, but it's a very visually compelling thing.
So there's a few things that comes to mind, right? I'm this guy who's a naturalist. I like to try and understand things like as much as I can naturally. And there's some things I'll probably never know. But what really makes me think is you have immersed yourself in art, and the significance of stuff like this is far more important to you than it is the average Joe. And I say that because, like, for example, as I've been learning more about Greek stuff, the Greek mythology and the origins of Rome, let's say with the stories of Romulus, let's imagine if not only did we have something that was a depiction of Romulus or Julius Caesar, and I'm not talking about a bust, I'm talking, here is a cloth of after he was killed by the Senate, okay, and here's Julius Caesar, and we have a cloth, and it wasn't just a cloth that we know was invented. There's a mystery not only behind the story of the development of this cloth, and some naysayers and some pro-sayers, people are saying it is, and some are saying it isn't, and there's this dispute, but millions of people. And that historically, anthropologically, we've all been drawn, and there's people who have just reverenced this Romulus cloth. And I'm making this up as I go, but I'm making the point. And here you are, you're facing a man who was a god man, a man who was seen as the biggest thing in history. The development of Western civilization is due to a man and his brother. And we know the stories or whatever. You can imagine the reverence of the myth and the whole thing just comes to life like a theater. And you're looking at it and you're going, Romulus, is that you? You know what I'm saying? Like, I can imagine that. I get excited thinking about it too, because I'm looking at this man. This man changed the world.
Yeah. Well, to take a more contemporary example, and I don't mean to be flippant about this. If someone's going to accuse me of being flippant, but I don't mean this at all. Look at the reverence for Elvis. Now, I mentioned that I am teaching a class currently right now at my university on icons. And we just had a class seminar discussion just the other week on modern pilgrimage that kind of looks at pilgrimage that people go on today and how it relates to medieval forms of pilgrimage, or like pilgrimages to the Shroud of Turin, which, happened back in the period that I write about in my book. But there's a really fascinating series of essays written by another art historian, a guy named Gary Viken, Vikan. I'm going to plug him here. I don't know him. We never met him, but I'm going to plug Gary Viken. He is a scholar, a prominent scholar of Byzantine art and architecture. And he's written on modern day pilgrimages to Graceland and really drawn parallels between medieval forms of pilgrimage and the kind of belief in the ritual and what you acquire from the ritual of traveling and going and being in the physical places and interacting with the objects that direct. When people go to Graceland, I'm not an Elvis fan. If this was Beethoven, it'd be a different thing, right? But Elvis is not my speed. But I understand that Elvis. When people like really hardcore Elvis fans, you go to Graceland. That is a religious experience, and you feel like you are in the presence of someone that you believe is like fundamentally changed, altered the course of human civilization, right? That's not that different. Again, I don't mean it flippant. I'm not trying to equate Jesus with Elvis. I mean, I'm either gonna piss off the Jesus fans or the Elvis fans, no matter what I say here, right?
No, I get it.
But the idea is like, this is something that it makes sense. Like if there's like, a reverence for somebody, an absolute reverence for somebody, when you go to the places where they lived or were born or died, and you see the objects that they owned, or you see the clothing that they wore, and as happened back in the medieval period, as happened with the Shroud of Turin, and as happens at Graceland, there's even miracles that are attributed to certain objects that are associated with those sites. Of course, it's going to have that captivating sort of, that kind of captivating appeal. Despite that, I was still surprised how much the Shroud of Turin fascinated me from a visual perspective. But again, it shouldn't surprise me that much, right? Because I think there are many instances today, going all the way back to antiquity, where, of course, that makes sense that there was.
It's a wonderful thing that you point out as someone who takes a different conclusion than the art piece that you particularly are reverencing in a way in your research. I appreciate you on this, because you're not just a debunker who laughs and scoffs and this, like, you appreciate the art. And I mean, you're an artist, so what you're into the art.
I'm not an artist. I'm an historian, which means I cannot make a single thing, but I appreciate what other people make. So
right. And I think that plays a role, but either way, I appreciate having people like you who still have drawn other conclusions at the end of the day on the ontological aspects of things. But, this really, it fascinates me. It makes me think about hero worship and also ancestry worship. I don't know why, but I think anthropologically there's this sense that when I go and I've seen, clothing artifacts of, well-known Hollywood figures that go back into the 50s, that you kind of feel like you're reliving their life. And I kind of wonder if there's some aspect, and I'm thinking evolution here in our development of, animism, and then our ancestors and agency after death and all of these things that kind of play a role. It's mystical. It's kind of like, it gives us this sense of reverence that they're still around somehow. Here I am looking at this image, but this man is still alive in a way. It comes to life because of the relic. And the practice of, here's the Lord's body, there's life in that. They see him as alive. So there's a lot of questions that can be asked. I don't think we have complete answers for. It's just really fun to speculate here. Is there anything else we're leaving out you might want to mention pertaining to the shroud?
Anything? Well, gosh, I mean, the shrouds.
I know there's so much
stuff.
Is there anything else in this episode? Because I would love to do more with you in the future on things we haven't.
No. My fascination with the Shroud of Turin is not like a vacuum. Like, it does come from a fascination in sort of what I call icons, or what we understand to be icons. And I don't mean like cultural icons, like George Clooney is a cultural icon, not that, but like images, like this power that we believe or we attribute to images. In my field of art history, my academic field of art history, we are only, I feel like, recently kind of coming around to the kinds of issues of belief in images that are from a kind of mystical or spiritual or kind of ineffable kind of or untangible kind of a place. And I think there needs to be a dignity accorded to those things. Even if I myself don't share, like, I don't really believe that the shroud was painted by God as what they said in the texts that I researched for my book. I don't really believe that statues of the Virgin Mary are actually crying out tears of blood. But the fact is, a lot of people do have that mystical reverence for the miraculous. That's an anthropological issue. And I think that is sort of what I'm interested in sort of bringing into my field. Because art, just to be brief about this, art history for very long was about like, ooh, who painted what? And who are the famous painters? Like, ooh, we love Michelangelo, and we, like less the unknown painters and that kind of thing. And it's always been kind of like, well, that's great, but like, what do we do with these things that those artists made? Because they weren't made just to be admired as great works of art. Religious images were made to be prayed to. And religious images were made to facilitate a kind of devotional, mystical engagement between a believer and that object. And I want to bring those issues back in. Whether I believe in them myself or not is kind of irrelevant.
Thank you.
It really has to do with the fact that this tells us a lot about how we are wired as human beings, that, large numbers of people sustain those kinds of beliefs. I also think there's a desire, this gets into a realm of psychology that I'm not trained to delve into, but clearly there's a need, a desire, a want to believe in something that is beyond our comprehension.
Right.
And I kind of get that. I'm a sports fan. I'm realizing now I'm probably every bit as superstitious of a sports fan as what I accuse other sports fans of being, like I will watch certain games of my beloved teams, and if I'm not wearing the right shirt, I believe that somehow I have an impact on the outcome of that game. That's ludicrous, right? That is plainly ludicrous. But I think there's room for sort of even a rational mind to sort of grasp for things that are just beyond our comprehension. And it's harmless mostly, right? Like if I wear the wrong like University of Michigan t-shirt during a football game and they lose, it's largely harmless if I kind of blame myself for that loss, you know? But I think it says a lot about sort of like, what is it that we need that says, okay, I want to know that I can explain all these things, but I also want something out there that is more magical, more
Right.
mystical, that I can't explain, or I feel like nobody can explain. I think the Shroud of Turin and icons, the belief in images behaving in certain ways, and belief in images, you know, photographs of a deceased relative on your mantle. Do you think of that as just a photograph, or do you believe that somehow there's a power of, you know, presence there?
Yeah.
I think we need to dignify those things. I think that's totally like it's a human, it's an aspect of human nature that if we were to ignore, we risk misunderstanding what it is to be human.
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wow, that was really well put. I mean, that's why I brought up ancestry worship, because in Eastern practices, that's really well known. And I think in the Roman Empire also, there's this sense of ancestry worship. But we do this today. Go to Disney World. You'll see all of your myths alive, okay?
Yeah.
All of your myths, Mickey Mouse, you name it, Daffy Duck. And I remember as a child in Cooperstown, New York, my grandparents are from Cooperstown, New York. And there's the Baseball Hall of Fame there. But not only is there the Baseball Hall of Fame, there was this man who had a little hut who was Santa, and this is where he lived. It was his house. I was a little child, and I used to go in there. Once a year, we'd visit Cooperstown, New York, and I'd go and I'd sit on actual Santa's lap, and he would talk to me. And I knew he knew everything I did. I knew he knew, you know, and it was all not literally true, but it was true to me. And it was alive at the moment. It was real. And so I'd watch these images, or I'd hear the bells, the little jingle, and they had like this golf catcher that they'd put little bells on and beat it off the roof at night in Cooperstown to make us think Santa just landed. Go to sleep. Awesome. He's going to know we're awake. Like, you know, there's living these things, and they're fun. We do them with comic books and all of these things. So it's a human thing to do them. And there's some people who make them harmful practices and activities.
Sure.
So there's this competition I'm trying to compete with. Value the myths, even if you think they're real, but trying to find a way to still be progressive and not divide humanity so much so that our tribalism is causing us to cause trauma in other people's lives in a negative effect. I'm trying to create a positive one and realize like, hey, so I do dismantle a lot of these things, these texts and such. But at the end of the day, it's like, I don't care what you believe, as long as you're not out here harming people, because the view I came out of was so extreme and fundamentalist that it was very harmful, not only for me, but for the people around me. Every time I had to bring up Jesus, I had to talk about how are you living right? What do you believe? Your beliefs aren't right. You need to get your beliefs right. I was a Reformed Calvinist at the end, and I was just obsessive. I was a caged Calvinist who was bashing everyone, predestination, the whole 9 yards. And it's like, my personality is a little extreme too, so that didn't help. But yeah, I'm trying to admire these things like you are. One last thing I want to bring up, and I'll let you go, because you've got to go and teach some more after this. You bring up this image in your lecture. I wish we had the image, but either way, there's this image of it looks like a cathedral or something with characters, but it comes to life. You talk about a lot of these images that come to life. Actually, the eyes move, where it looks like it's actually alive. And you said, well, if we had, you know, paper cutouts, and marched these characters down the streets, you know, people wouldn't come out in the millions. But we have actual modern day soccer teams that are going to march in the streets, and people are coming out to see them. And they did this with Mary and Jesus, of course, but Mary was so admired. I wonder if it plays some significant role to the apparitions of Mary in the Catholic paradigm. Why they constantly see Mother Mary. She's so adorned in the images that they have. She comes to life in those images, the statues, and what they teach, Hail Mary, the whole nine. That now they see a light in the sky or something, and it's Mary, or they're seeing Mary. Do you think there's some significance to that?
Yeah, I think it's a cultural context in which it's not only okay to believe in the mystical, but it's encouraged. I mean, the ground is seeded for that. And if you don't believe in those miracles or those apparitions, then you're the weird one, you know? That's just common. The period that I focus on, I'm an art historian of the Renaissance and Baroque period, meaning the 13, 14, 15, and 1600s. And, you know, those are a dime a dozen. Those kinds of what we might call, or what we might unfortunately dismiss as legends and myths, or you know, just things that didn't really occur, but you know, are documented as if they were real. That was just simply that was the culture, and still is for some people today. But yeah, I think you know. The example you're referring to is like the procession of a altarpiece showing the Madonna and Child, like the Virgin Mary and the Christ Child enthroned. And this is an altarpiece for a church in Siena in Italy. That was like the main focal point for people in Siena. That's where they pray. They pray to Mary through that particular altarpiece to ensure their own safety. Like Mary has special protection over them, protecting them from famine and warfare and all the rest. And when that altarpiece was completed by the very human artist that made it, they paraded it through the streets from the artist workshop to install in the cathedral. And it wasn't like, you know, a delivery by the UPS man at some like random hour in the afternoon. This was an event. This was a public event. People crowd the streets. And when you see this altarpiece that shows the Virgin and Child enthroned, it really is treated as if that is actually the Virgin and Child being paraded through the streets. So that is the kind of culture where that's expected. It's not that far of a jump then to sort of understand that people are having, you know, these visions of the Virgin Mary herself appearing everywhere. That's, you know, it's not to be ridiculed. It may be different from our experience today or our beliefs today, but that is the culture at the time that was very much mainstream.
Just my final take is this. I do want to point out as much as I can with our modern understanding of what I think is factual and what I think is probably going into the mystical and experience place. Not taking away. I mean, you can't take away people's experience, because if you do, then they just discredit you. There's no listening if you're not actually understanding. I know from having experiences, people try to say, and this is off topic of that, but they say that I was never a Christian. They have theological reasons why. It's not because I didn't really have experiences. It was because their doctrine, well, he who endures to the end will be saved. And you haven't endured to the end, so you must not be saved. You know, all this stuff. Yeah. At the end of the day, I know the experiences that I had in these things. Now, I attribute all of those experiences now as a naturalist, explaining them with natural phenomena. We have chemicals in the brain, the social construct, the environment in which it came to life for me. All of that worked. And it was tapping into real things that I actually experienced in real life. Equated my mother, my father, my sister, my brother, you know, those things came to life and they were real. However, as leaving Christianity, I still know Christians are attaching that experience to what I call myth. But I understand the myth carries value to them. Yeah. I want to know the facts of maybe what they really are, but I understand how they come to life. And some of these positions are, I think, harmful, the way that people are living with them. That's not really your point of coming on the show today. I'm pointing out there's some extremist groups and ideas that are out there. God hates fags, or like, you know, the whole plethora of dangerous ideology that comes with it. And I want to debunk that. I want people to start being more mature and realize to come together, even if you have a tradition that you particularly see as actually ontologically true, even if I disagree. And you've done a wonderful job today talking about the Shroud. I think we can really go into this much more as time goes by. And we'll be seeing you soon in December to try and translate the Italian. I thought it was French at first. I was like, French. Oh, no, it's Italian.
It's Italian. Yep.
Yeah, I look forward to that. Maybe I'll ask him some more of the difficult debunking.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious what and I know him, of course, but I'm curious what he'll say. Before I leave, though, I want to make sure I do properly, again, plug the book, right? An Artful Relic, The Shroud of Turin in Baroque Italy, came out a few months ago, so it is available on Amazon or through my press's website at psupress.org. That's the Pennsylvania State University Press, one of the greatest academic presses that exists. And this is the book. It was 10 years in the making, and buy it. It could change the world.
That is awesome. Yeah, there's the Amazon link, but if you want to go through his press as well, it's down in the description. Click the link. either way you go, you're getting the book. Leave a comment, leave a positive comment. Look, follow him on Amazon. You'll get an email letting you know that you're following him in case he ever has anything in the future. But go down there and leave you a nice little review. We need to get some reviews on here, and let us know what you think of this show. The way we're delicately trying to handle not only the shroud, but relics in history and understanding them as they were understood the best we can. That would be that. I think this is the best way to approach this kind of topic anyway, because if you're just out here trying to debunk stuff, you're really not understanding. You're putting yourself in their shoes to know why, even if you come to a different conclusion. So get the book. Let us know what you think about it. I'm really excited to hear your guys' thoughts about this episode, as well as the material you might be reading in here. Do you plan on ever putting this on Audible, or is it purely going to be written because you need images and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know how Audible works. That's beyond my comprehension. So, I mean, there's an ebook version of it. I do know that it's both in like actual hard copy, but also you can get a ebook version as well, which is cheaper, of course. But I'm an old-fashioned person. I can never buy a book that's not like something I can actually hold and put on my shelf. So, but there are other versions for people that are more technologically inclined, let's say.
Well, I like the hardback. Show that the spine real quick, because I like that kind of a spine there. That that's a nice. You know, when you're filling a book and you have different kinds, and you're like, oh, yeah. I like the way that one's built.
I mean, it's great. It's really high quality. High quality paper, and it's really it's a fabulous book. This is what my press does. I work with the greatest academic press that I know of, and I'm just blessed that they've published now both of my books. But this is the latest one, and it's I'm very proud of it. And this is a dream come true. This is my life's ambition. I got into academia. I became an art historian so that I could write this book, and now I've written it. So now y'all gotta buy it so I can get the royalties and retire early. And I can have more time to talk with you on your show.
Exactly. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in case you're wanting a relic to chant, let's just say, don't forget, we are MythVision.